Now we speak about the Shemitah, about the sabbatical year, that not only are you not permitted to be involved in the agricultural process, plowing, planting, reaping, all that, and the produce, as we discussed many times, the sabbatically all the produce is considered ownerless, and everyone is free to take whatever he chooses to take, but the produce itself has a degree of sanctity. And because of that, you cannot engage commercially with the produce, selling it like you would sell anything else. And let's say a person would go in and he has the right to take as much as he wants. And after he takes a tremendous amount of produce, he becomes a seller and he sells the produce. He's in violation of the laws of Shemitah, because you cannot demonstrate any level of ownership over the produce of the Shemitah. It's not only working the land, but engaging commercially in its produce, it's a Torah violation. And we'll see that if one does, and the only reason why one does is for financial gain, ultimately, whatever he believes he's gaining, he will lose. Not only will he lose his house, he will lose his personal movables. Ultimately, he himself will become impoverished. He will sell his daughter into slavery, and eventually he himself will have to be sold into slavery if he doesn't make the correction on it. And not only in slavery to a Jew, he may be sold to a non-Jew as a slave. And it's going to go from bad to worse. If he doesn't make the correction as he sees the slippery slope and he's going down the slope financially and he doesn't so-called understand what's happening, it goes from bad to worse. Financially, because he engaged in commercially in the produce of Shvius, produce of the sabbatical year. So there's a beautiful midrash, first midrash in Bahar, cites a pasuk in Mishlei, where Shlomo Melch says, and he goes through the whole history of people who wanted to swallow up the world. And because they wanted to swallow up the world, not only did they not have what they wanted to achieve, they even lost what they had. It speaks about if you sell something to your fellow, niva lahon ishra oyin. Niva lahon, a person's overwhelmed because he wants to amass possessions. Ishra oyin, that person has an evil eye. And the person wouldn't even realize that overwhelming need to amass wealth, which ultimately he has an evil eye because of that, not only will not bring gain, it will bring loss. So the Midrash says, this pasuk speaking about many people. Niva lahon ishra oyin, who is a person, the first person, who is nival from the word beholo, a person becomes bewildered because he's so overwhelmed, intoxicated to acquire wealth. Zekayin. Kain was the first one. Well, how did this manifest itself? Omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ato nifalto l'rishus olam. Now, why did Kain kill Hevel? What was the fight over? Well, Kain was the favorite son. That's interesting. We find that Chava called Kain, because she says, I have a partnership with God. I acquired a human being together with God. He's the first person to be born. So we say the three partners in a human being. There's the father, the mother, and there's God. Each one provides another aspect of the child. And she calls him Kain. We find Hevel, his mother, his father don't call him Hevel. He became Hevel. What does Hevel mean? Hevel means futility. Hevel was not the so-called, in his parents' eyes, wasn't valued as that favorite special child. Because he wasn't the firstborn and he was like the second child, he was the secondary. Cain immediately felt that the world wasn't big enough for both of them. You have a whole world, him and his brother, and he's nival lahon. He wants it all. So what does he do? He kills his brother. That's what happens. After he kills his brother, what does God say? God says, where's your brother? He says, am I my brother's keeper? So Hashem says to Cain, your brother's bloods are calling out from the ground. So Rashi explained, what do you mean bloods? That all the generations that if you'd been alive, you would have fathered and brought into existence, you denied him that, so therefore you're culpable. So what are you going to be? You're going to be nov and nod. You're going to wander for the rest of your life, and you're not going to be in any location. And Rashi over there cites the Chazal, that wherever Cain went, the earth started to quake, started to shake, and people wanted nothing to do with the man. The person became a wandering nomad. Wherever he went, people stayed away from him. So here you wanted to take in the whole world, and that's why you killed your brother, nivel home. You actually became overwhelmed and bewildered, intoxicated for the sake of material acquisition. Therefore, at the end of the story, you have nothing. Even what you had a right to, even that you're not going to have. He didn't realize he's going to have a loss. What happened? He actually was taken from one location to another. Shenemar, Nova Notia Boritz, Dover Acher, Nivel Nishrayin. Who's another individual who is of this ilk? The Ephron Achiti. Ephron, the one who sold Avram Avinu, the Morsamach Pelo. B'Shoshem is a Sora. Holach Avram Eitzel Ephron. When Sarah passed away, Avram went to Ephron. Shim Kodo Samoro. Said he should sell him the cave. Omalo Ephron, Tedli Domel. So Ephron says to Avram Avinu, give me the money for it. Omalo Eretz Arba Meis Shekel Kesed Ben Vit Chamai. And Ephron originally had said, I will gift it to you because you're a prince of God and so on and so forth. And then he says, and what's 400 shekel kesed between two friends like us? It's meaningless. First, he's giving it away. And then he says, and what's $400? It's not a big number. So the Gemara says, and the Medrash says, tzadikim omre mat vosem harbe. A tzaddik, he says very little, but he does an enormous amount. When the Malachim came, the guests, which he believed they were human beings, and he offered his hospitality, what did he say? Eko pas lechem. I'll take a morsel of bread, have a bite, then you go on your way. And the Gemara goes and shows that what Avram had hosted the Malachim, Suda Shlomo Bishato, Shlomo Melech at the height of his power, his banquet was not any more than Avram had hosted the angels. So tzadikim, omrimat, a tzaddik, he says very, very little because he's not in any way gaining favor. He does it, but what does he do? When he delivers enormously. Rishoim, omrim harbe, a Russia promises you the world. At the end of the day, he doesn't deliver as much as an iota. Originally, he said to Avram, consider it yours. It's a gift. At the end of the day, we'll see in a moment, not only did he charge him an enormous amount of money, he would not take minted coins unless they were a level of value, which nowhere in the world would they turn down this type of currency, which were newly minted, very large silver coins. His Avram Tzover Sakesef Lefron. So Avram started to count out, and he piled up the silver for Ephron for the purchase. Shnema Avisha Avram El Ephron V'Yishkalo. He weighed out the silver. The reason why it's called shekel. Why is the shekel called a shekel? Because the word shokel means that you weigh it out, right? In the olden days when they minted coins, the silver was weighed, and then it was imprinted with the denomination of currency, which indicated the weight of the silver. Okay. Omer ben Moro, Alpi Shomer Reb Chanina Kol Shkolim Shem Torah Sloim. Even though Reb Chanina says that all the shkolim in the Torah are slom, which we discussed today in the Gemara of Mitzvah, chutz me'elu. Normally, it's sloim, which are 4 dinarim, but here they're called kantorim. Arba Beis Kantorim Tzova Avram Lefnei Ephron. They were little, enormously large silver coins. Kevon Shiro Ephron is a kesef. When Ephron didn't realize how wealthy Avram Avinu was, when he started to weigh out this silver and he started to pile it up, Nivel v'nechbas, he became overwhelmed. He never saw this kind of wealth. But Omar, so initially he wasn't that specific what Ephron what he was going to offer him. The Nifchak V'rein Kfar Mesech, when he saw that amount of money, he says, no, only the best. The choices of the graves I will give you. Omar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so Hashem says, Nifhalta L'mamon, because you were overwhelmed when you saw the money. And we'll see he had the evil eye, as we always say, Ephron, which is Choser with the Vav deleted, is the same numerical value as Ayin Ra. Hashem says to Ephron, because of this, not only will you not have a gain, you're going to have a loss. What's the loss? Omal Chisrona. What was Ephron's loss? Amr Yehuda Alev Bar Shalom. Kol Ephron Shekosav Kan. Every time Ephron is written in the Torah, Achlo Notla Kesem Avram Mole. The word Ephron is spelled in its full spelling with the Vav. At this moment, when he saw and he says, B'mifchak Foreinu, which is an indication of his evil eye, that he couldn't control himself, the Yishkal Avram Ephron, it says when he weighed out the silver to Ephron, and he saw this enormous Ephron, Choser, Vovksiv. There, at that moment, Ephron is written with the Vav deleted. So we see here, the man wanted more. So Hashem says, not only will you not have a gain, you're going to have a loss. What was the loss? Ephron is written in its full spelling. Here it's written Choser, Vav. So the obvious question is, a man like Ephron, the man is a heathen. The man is a bad guy. As we said, Risham Obrim Harbe, Afilumat. He's being depicted. They promise you the world, they don't deliver as much as Nyota. If you tell me he had a financial loss because of his one thing, Ephron, you tell me, by the way, when your name is going to be mentioned in Torah, the Vav is going to be deleted. Therefore, you won't have a gain. Not only won't you have a gain, you're going to have a loss. What's the loss, Ephron? What is it? Simple understanding. The answer is every word of the Torah, every letter of the Torah is part of eternity. Whether you appreciate it or you don't appreciate it, it's irrelevant. But that Ephron is identified with one letter less, that's something all the material wealth in the world is not the equivalent of that. That was the loss. Whether Ephron appreciates it doesn't make a difference whether he appreciates it or not. But factually, you thought you're going to have a gain because you're Ayin Ra, and he's being identified as that. Because he said the numerical value of Ephron without the Vav is evil eye, is Ayin Ra. That is the loss. That you firstly, one letter less in reference wise. Secondly, that spelling, its representation is God is labeling you in terms of what your essence, which is something which is very bad. Dover Acher. Another example of what Nivelon Ishra Ayin, Zamalve Mosa Beribis. A person who lends his money with interest. There's a Torah violation. A Jew is not permitted to lend his money with interest. Why? Why does a person lend money with interest? People need capital. You have capital. So you have an opportunity when you have them against the wall and he has no choice and he needs money for investment, for other reasons, he agrees to pay that fee for the usage of your money. So that person, the impetus for that is Nivela Hasher. Here he's saying something interesting. Not only will you not gain, but whatever you have, a curse will come upon your possessions. The Malbim explains it with an allegory. It's like a person, he steals, puts it in his pocket, and because of the weight of the coins in his pocket, a small hole develops, and all the coins, he doesn't realize they fall out through that hole. So not only does he lose the coin that he put into the pocket, which was the interest, because it created this weight, which created the hole, all the money that he had that was in his pocket initially, which was intact and secure, he loses everything. And that's what Shlomo Mel is saying. Not only will he not gain from the interest, but it brings a curse into his possessions that he even loses what he had. Shenemar, he won't even realize. Thinks he's gaining financially, but a loss will come upon him, and this is the curse will come upon his nechosim. The Chofetz Chaim writes in the Avos Chesed, he has a work, the loving kindness, and he writes over there about all aspects and applications of Chesed, of doing Chesed, and he writes over there, there's a positive commandment that a Jew has an obligation to lend his fellow money if he's in need. But of course, he says, no, but Torah doesn't want you to be a fool. If a person can't guarantee payment, whether it's collateralizing it or getting a cosigner, what we call an orev, that's not called lending. That's being irresponsible. He speaks at length of this. He says there's a mechanism that we're able to circumvent the problem that it should not be considered interest. It's called the heteriska, which means you construct a loan as an investment document, and therefore the lender, he's not actually charging interest, but rather he's receiving a dividend on the money that he's giving the person. It's a document that it's written up in a way, and it's constructed, and therefore it's not considered interest, it's considered an investment. So Chofetz Chaim writes, a person who has no choice, a person is a banker. That's his profession. So you want to be a banker and you have Jewish borrowers, the loan has to be based on this document, which is to construct it in a way that it should not be considered interest. But he says a person, he has other means of support. He says the person has money available. He says, you say you can't do chesed with your fellow Jew? He says you have to make a few crumbs of silver because you're not making enough. You have to make a little bit more. Because the moment you write that riska, you realize it's not the mitzvah of lending money any longer because it's not called a loan. So here you have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, and the loan is secure, and it's not something which you need for your livelihood. It's just, if I can make a little more, why not? But what's the cost of that? The cost of that is you're forfeiting a mitzvah that there's a positive commandment to lend your fellow money. As a result of that, he says people are fools. Told over a story recently, the Chofetz Chaim, he had in Europe a Jew when he rode in a coach. The coachman was always a Jew. A non-Jew could not be trusted because non-Jews, when they would take their Jewish passengers into a forest, they were suspect, they would kill them. So therefore, a Jew would only ride in a coach that the coach driver was a Jew. But the Chofetz Chaim, because very often he had to go on certain missions, he had his own reserved Jewish coachman, and he had the coach always ready to go. And the Chofetz Chaim was coming back from Vilna. And he had a son-in-law by the name of Mendel Zaks, who was his youngest son-in-law. The Chofetz Chaim had a child when he was in his early 70s. And this Reb Mendel Zaks, the Zakses, Reb Mendel Zaks, who was a Yeshiva University, that was the son-in-law of the Chofetz Chaim. So he's a young man. The Chofetz Chaim already is a man in his 90s, early 90s. They're coming back from whatever, some mitzvah mission, and they come in back about 2 a.m. So the Chofetz Chaim says to his son-in-law, did you pay the coachman? He's a Jew. You know, the fee. He says, of course I paid. I even gave him a tip. He says, that's not my question. My question is, when you paid him, did you have in mind to fulfill the mitzvah, that when a Jew works for you and you have to pay him at the end of the day, and you pay him, you're fulfilling the mitzvah's positive commandment that you paid him on the day after he finishes work. Because if you delay payment and the payment is expected, you're in violation of a negative commandment. So did you have in mind when you gave him the money to fill the mitzvah saseh of b'yom titan lo scharo? So he says, I didn't have it in mind. So the Chofetz Chaim made with his hand, you missed an opportunity. So the Chofetz Chaim is saying here, you have an opportunity to fulfill a mitzvah saseh of what? Of lending your fellow Jew money. And it's not your livelihood. So you don't need it to put bread on the table. But if you have a few extra coins and you want to make a few crumbs of silver, rather than fulfilling the mitzvah of lending the money, which is a positive commandment, you constructed with this document called Heterisko, and you forfeit the mitzvah of what? Of lending money. That's the Chavetz Chaim. So therefore, he says, so what about a person who lends money with interest? And this is nivel lahon. Not only will he not gain from it, ultimately, a curse will come upon its possessions, and at the end of the day, is no good. Now, there's always a question, how do you balance the books? Person has tremendous profits. Doesn't have, his account says you're making tremendous money. The business is healthy. But he doesn't realize all of a sudden, he has doctor bills and he has failing health. And at the end of the day, when you balance the books, you realize that, and you have to go to a sanitarium because you have asthma and you have other problems and you have problems with your kids, or with your grandchildren and other issues. And then you have a lawsuit with the government, the IRS is there, everything under the sun, God has his way to bring about, to turn everything upside down, regardless of how well you're doing financially. So, Me'era Yovel ben Chosov, this is the chesed. You lend money, not only will you have gain with interest, God forbid, a curse will come, but what's the impetus? What's driving the person? What's driving the person is what? He's hungry, and therefore he doesn't think rationally, and he does things which he shouldn't be doing. There were a number of scams over the past 30, 40 years. Most people who fall victim to scams is why? Because if you can make that kind of money, how do you turn it down? Tell you a story with Alan's uncle, with Armin Lindenbaum. Armin Lindenbaum, he used to be part of our group. He used to learn with us for a number of years. And he used to come by, and Alan was part of the group. And Armin Lindenbaum says to me, did you ever hear of a man by the name of Madoff? That's what he asked me. Because, a lot of names crossed my desk. So I said, never heard the name. I said to him, is he a Sephardic Jew? Because usually Bukharins and Afghanis, the names end with OFF. Shimonov, Aronov, that's names. I said, he's a Sephardic Jew. I said, I have no idea. He says, I've been trying to give him money, and he doesn't want to take my money as an investment. This is what he says to me. And I had to call somebody. I had to have special pull to be able to even get a little bit of money in there. He doesn't want to take my money. And people are making money. You can't imagine the returns on that investment. This story goes back, 30 years ago. I said, Armin, I have no idea. But at the end, what happened? With those kinds of returns, how could you turn it down? But you understand, those kinds of returns are not reality. At the end of the day, it turned out to be a scam. The same thing. People think you charge interest. You're making money. Shlomo Melech says, the person who, if that's the impetus, ultimately, not only will you not gain, Meira Yovel ben Chosov, a curse will come. So what happened? Everything imploded, exploded. It was disastrous what it did to people's lives. What it did to his own life. Where did he end up? You raise a child and you teach him good lessons, and the child doesn't learn. And you warn the child, someday you behave that way, you're going to get burnt, you're going to get hurt. And the child, your son, or this person doesn't believe you, doesn't want to take good advice. At the end of the day, it comes to haunt him, and he regrets that he ever did it. At the end of the day, unless he's truly a sick man, like Madoff was a sick person. Davar achid nivo lahon elu ishra. Who's Shalmech referring to? Elu sochri shvius. Those engaged commercially in selling the produce of the sabbatical year. Shem is balin lashir. They're like overwhelmed, driven to become wealthy. They mishamer shvius, and therefore they don't observe the shvius. Usfurin shem asher, and they think by engaging commercially, selling the produce that they're not permitted to sell, they can become wealthy. Omar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Chayecha, I swear on your life, Chesron yesh l'cho bedavar. Here you're going to take a hit. You can take a loss. Kevan shlo shomer sa shmita, because you did not keep the shmita. Hischila meir nechneses b'mono u'mocher. The curse comes upon him, and he has to sell. People speak. Their peaks, their valleys in business, their trends. So what is a person attributed to? It's a trend. There's a trend. The Torah says the land has to be fallow for Hashem. Has the rent. Then the Torah speaks, and if a person sells something. The thighs are pillars of sheish, of marble, founded on adnei poz, on sockets made of gold, precious gold. A pillar has like something on the top of it, and it has something which secures it on its base. There's always an introduction, and always there's the punchline at the end of the day. That's the opening statement. Then it speaks about the Jubilee year, which is similar. You can't sell the land more than 49 years because Hashem says, I am the landlord. You people are only tenant farmers. If a Jew does not observe the Shemitah and the Yovel, even one, ultimately, you're going to have to sell your property. As it says, you begin selling off your assets. Persons, but have someone begin selling off your assets. Chozabo, if he does tshuva, when he realizes that he did the wrong thing, he does tshuva. It's something very positive. Vimlo yazabo, but if he doesn't get the message, as they say, sofshu mocher esodeu, he sells his field, which is much more significant than selling a movable. The person becomes impoverished, and he has to sell from his family heirloom, the property which belonged to the family. If he does tshuva at that point, it's very positive. Not only does he sell his property, he has to sell the house, which is his residence. A house which is in a walled city. If he gets the message, it's positive. Ultimately becomes impoverished. He has to go seek out alms. He has to beg. He has to come to you. He's become so impoverished, he has to extend his hand to you. At that point, he does tshuva, fine, it's good. He'll become so extreme, he'll have to sell himself into slavery. Because of his impoverished state, he has to sell himself as an indentured servant. If at that point he wakes up, it's good. Not only does he sell himself to a Jewish master, he sells himself to a non-Jewish master. Ger means not a Jew, it means a ger toshav. A non-Jew keeps the 7 Noahide laws. Lo levado, el v'chol Yisrael. Not only this is not an individual situation. If all Jews don't behave properly, that's going to be the predicament of all Jews, and ultimately it leads to exile. B'shvil shechilu, Moshe Yirmiyahu, who witnessed the Churban Abayis, the destruction of the first temple, b'shvil shechilu as because the Jews did not observe the sabbatical years. Nimkru l'goyim, the Jews were sold. When we went to exile, they were sold as slaves to the non-Jews. Shnemar. Vayal Aleim Melech Kazdim, the Kazdian king came upon them. Vayarog Bachureim Bacherev Beis Mikdoshan. He killed their youth in the Beis Hamikdosh. Vayogel Asheris, and he exiled the remnant that was left. Vayulo Ulabonov Lavodim, and he and his children, they became slaves. Hari Inyan Yisrael. Omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu LeMoshe, Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Rei Heichlim Korah Lagoyim. Just see how the Jews ultimately will be sold to the nations of the world as slaves. Because they desecrated, because they did not observe the sabbatical year. But it says you're obligated to redeem your brother, and you refer to us as your brother and as your intimate friends. It says, the Jews are called Achai V'Rei by Hashem. Hashem man Achai V'Rei, Pasuk in Tilim, And it goes on again to emphasize this point. But what was the cause? What's the cause of all this? Because nifalto lahon, because we're overwhelmed, we're driven, we want to achieve that dream, regardless how. But it's that, what's the dream? To make it big financially, but ultimately, by doing the wrong thing, everything eventually collapses. And not only don't you have what you think you're going to have, you have less and you never succeed.